Heyo! I'm here to moan about something again. Can you guess what it is this time?
A couple of days ago, at least at the time of this recording, a series of tweets by this person rocked the FGC. To summarize, Mika here went on what can be best described as a tirade attacking fighting games for their many perceived crimes. Mostly, however, Mika focused on how fighting games demand precisely timed and complex input commands from their player base. This series of tweets got a shitload of traction, and seemingly every person in the entire FGC shared their take on it.
All right, it has to be said, you are bad at the video
This
game.
shit just reeks of salt.
10 out of 10. One of the worst threads I ever read on here.
So much typing just to say I suck at video games.
Games are
We know
bad.
from us brain damaging thread I've ever read.
Fighting games. That's what I say.
Just say you are bad and move
This
on.
actually has to be the worst take I've ever seen.
Well,
Some people really enjoy learning.
Most of these kind of boil down to, you say you dislike these aspects of fighting games, but we actually like them, so f*** off. In a general sense, I tend to agree with this take. I rest my shoulders pretty squarely in the camp of execution demands being a good and rewarding aspect of fighting games. I have my personal reasons for this. Firstly, I find training mode a pretty relaxing experience. Secondly, I like the very visible gains they grant to one's gameplay. And thirdly, I feel like it's a great way for newer players to feel like they're progressing towards matching the level of play they see in tournaments. We as humans, of course, tend to not require more justification for any one thing than I like it. And personally enjoying something is, I think, generally enough justification for said thing's continued existence, but it is cripplingly lacking any explanatory power. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's just saying, this thing is this way for whatever reason, and you either enjoy it or don't. Not to say that you necessarily have to unpack all the things you like and justify their inclusion, but in terms of responses to people who question said thing's inclusion, well, it comes up a bit short. So let's try to find one of these justifications for the demand of mechanical dexterity in fighting games.
Just to clarify, I did say one justification, not the justification. Just one.
And we're gonna do this vis-a-vis a certain StarCraft player and commentator, Sean Plott, perhaps better known as Day 9. A couple of years ago, I was watching Sean stream Brood War live on Twitch and was somewhat taken aback by how well he managed to both encapsulate and explain the game's execution demands. To summarize, when Sean was confronted by people who complained about Brood War being an unintuitive mess that actively hindered a player from just doing what they want to do in a strategy game, Sean responded with the following. Unlike something like chess, which is purely a strategy game, Brood War could be looked at through the lens of being a commander simulator. That is, the game puts you in the seat of the commander who has to juggle not only their own individual troops, but also all the logistical aspects of running a campaign. A commander could be the best of all time at maneuvering their forces through the battlefield, but if they lack logistical support and supplies, their campaign is sure to end with defeat. Brood War, in a sense, then simulates the demand for these qualities in a commander by way of forcing mechanical checks and logistical duties on the player. Now, you might be asking, how does this relate to fighting games at all? Well, just like with Brood War, a common complaint from people who dislike execution requirements in fighting games is that they represent a needless hindrance that's in the way of letting someone just do what they want to do. But I think the argument here is flawed. From our perspective, these people are looking at the game through a mismatched lens. It's quite easy to see how fighting games can be a frustrating experience if you believe the quote-unquote real game is a purely strategic one.
Just a little tip for you. It isn't.
If we instead consider the fighting game an attempt at conveying the experience of engaging in a specific activity, just like Brood War, but this time supplanting the commander role for that of the fighter in a combat sports or martial arts, then the mechanical dexterity aspect makes a lot of sense. Let's say we wanted to break down some key qualities an athlete needs to exhibit for them to perform well in a combat sport. For sake of simplicity, we'll limit it to just a few. Presumably, our fighter would benefit a lot from having a strong set of nerves, that is, being able to perform well when under immense pressure. Secondly, I think we could all agree that they need a strong theoretical knowledge base, e.g., having done research on both their own and their opponent's habits and fighting style. And lastly, of course, a strong athletic body fit for the task at hand. And there will, of course, be those that excel in one of these areas at the expense of another, or have entirely different and specialized skill sets. But I think it's hard to argue that a fighter doesn't need to exhibit all these qualities to at least some degree of competence in order to perform well. Now, does it seem reasonable to consider the physical training a boxer goes through as a needless hurdle in the way of the true strategic match of boxing? If we look at the fighting part of fighting games as not just window dressing on top of a purely strategic game, and instead an attempt at capturing the experience of engaging in the practice of martial art, but in a virtual form, then much like a martial art, fighting games require the player to exhibit many of the same qualities. The one real outlier here being the physical aspect, which becomes, if you can believe it, quite difficult to replicate. We can look at the design choice of locking certain aspects of the game behind muscle memory as an attempt to match said athleticism check in a combat sport. After all, these more or less strict sequences will require a certain amount of time and effort to be invested, excuse my poor wording here, outside of the game. This in order to access said sequence reliably in matches. In my opinion, when we see fighting games through this lens, we're presented with a pretty sound argument for the inclusion of so-called execution checks. They exist in an attempt to convey a, fuller experience, and in that attempt they allow fighting games to become what they are and to truly differentiate themselves from other, less physically based competitive endeavors. Lastly, I should add that while execution requirements might to the outsider seem like what decides the outcome of matches, they are at most levels of play just one small factor of all the things that separate the winning player from the loser. Just like none of these separate factors should be described as the real game, they also shouldn't be described as hindrances to accessing said real game. All of these factors are together what makes the game. Doing any and all of them means you're participating. Now, at the end of the day, this perspective probably won't change anyone's mind when it comes to the idea of forcing execution onto players. But hopefully it can illustrate a viewpoint from where said game mechanics make sense from a design perspective and not just be boiled down to instinctual personal preference. But hey, who knows? Maybe this explanation might help someone who is struggling with the why of execution to see the deeper beauty that is fighting games. And for those of you out there who still want purely strategic experiences, I would suggest you go play a strategy game instead. After all, there's plenty of those out there already. Hey, thanks for watching this video through to the end. I really appreciate that. Would also appreciate it a lot if you enjoyed this, that you consider liking the video or commenting or subscribing, all that jazz, as it were. Of course, thanks to all my lovely patrons who are up here on screen somewhere. Thanks a bunch for your support. I hope you liked this video. If you didn't, that's rough. I don't really have that much more to say, but thanks as always, and I guess I'll catch you guys on the flip side. That's a bit cringe.